First, we're going to start out by cutting our leather. And one tip I wanted to point out was when designers make larger pieces, like I'm cutting out this center panel here, they will oftentimes make a piece that says cut unfold. And what I like to do is I just like to put that piece on my leather and I will draw with a white marking pen, a leather marking pen. And in this case, the marking pen draws out white because it's on black leather, but on lighter leather, it will draw out gray. So it's still good for light or dark leather. And I will leave a link to one of the marking pens that I use down in the description. But what I will do with the pattern piece is I will take one side and I will draw out that half, and then I will flip it, meeting or mirror it, meeting the two sides together. And then some people, what they do is they'll print out two pattern pieces and tape them together. And you can do that as well. You just have to keep in mind that you don't want to include the extra seam allowance. So, you know, if you're doing that, make sure you test it out on a scrap piece of fabric to make sure that your pattern is not going to be skewed. So I'll continue cutting out my pattern pieces. The next step is to apply Decoville Heavy or some kind of stabilizer to our bottom panel. And I like to use Decoville Heavy. There's another stabilizer that you can use as well when working with leather. It's called Salpa, and it's the source that I use is from Rocky Mountain Leather, but this Decoville Heavy you can usually find at Joann's, and I just really like the way that it adheres to the leather, and later on I'll show you how I adhere my Decoville Heavy. And also when you're turning the bag, once applied properly, it does not wrinkle, and neither does the Salpa. The difference is that Decoville Heavy has a adhesive that you iron on, and the Salpa is a glued on. So it's just a matter of personal preference and the look that you're going for, but I highly recommend either Decoville Heavy when working with leather or Salpa. So now I'm just continuing cutting my pattern pieces for the zipper panels, and I also will use most of the rest of this leather for the straps. That I like to use is called Pro Tough Outdoor Waterproof Material, and I purchased mine from Walmart. You can get it normally if your Walmart has a fabric section, you can get it in that. They do carry limited colors, so you can also purchase it online, and I will leave a link to the Walmart website, but it's just called Pro Tough and it's waterproof. The reason why I like this is because it is a lighter material, but it's still got the plastic coating on the back, so it truly is waterproof. A lot of people will use Ottertex, and I love using Ottertex as well, but it is heavier. This Pro Tough is like a happy medium, and so what I'm doing now is I'm cutting out the accents for my internal slip pocket and the zipper pocket. I'm going to be doing an overlay for my lining zipper pocket, and I will show you how to do that as well. But right now I'm just prepping the lining. So the waterproof canvas does not need any stabilizer, but because I'm using quilt cotton for my interior pockets for the zip pocket and the slip pocket, I'm going to stabilize that, and I will show you how I stabilize and what stabilizer I use as well. And right now what I'm doing is I'm cutting out a piece of leather that will line the top of my internal slip pocket. I really like the look that that gives. You don't have to do that, but I just think that it adds a nice look. Now it's time to add the stabilizer and the interfacing to our lining pieces and our exterior. So right now I'm applying the Decoville Heavy to our bottom panel of our tote, the exterior leather portion. And what it requires is that you use a press cloth and dampen it. So I use a dry iron and I have a spray bottle of water, and I just dampen my press cloth right over the Decoville Heavy. The adhesive side is facing the wrong side of the leather, and what I'll do is I will just set my iron on that and adhere it for about 5 or 6 seconds. I like to start on the edges and on the corners so that it adheres really well. And then you just press it. You literally press it. My iron is a little bit on the heavy side, which I love. It works great for adhering stabilizer and interfacing. And then what I've done, instead of using an ironing board, I use a piece of sew-in Peltex, which is a really heavy stabilizer. I used to use Peltex in my bags, but I find that when you turn it, it just wrinkles way too much for my preference. So I've found other uses, like using it for a tabletop pressing station. So I just cut a bigger piece of that, and I really like using that instead of the ironing board because it gives you a lot more structure underneath. So Decoville Heavy, you can see you don't need to really press the iron for a long time on it, but it does take 30 minutes for the adhesive to set in, and that's why I do that now. The next step is to interface our quilt cotton accent pieces, so the interior slip pocket and also the interior zipper pocket lining. So I love to use SF 101 by Pellon, and there are so many interfacings that you can use, but I've used a lot of them and I just always go back to SF 101. So I buy it by the bolt when it's on sale and use your coupon from Joann's. And now I'm adhering, just lightly adhering the interfacing to the quilt cotton because I have adhesive side up. I don't want to get it all over my iron. So I'm just setting this now so that I can cut it out to size. And then what I will do is I will flip it over and properly adhere it. Again, I use a dry iron and I just literally press and move my iron over, as you can see here. Now that we prepared our interfacing and our stabilizer to our lining pieces and our exterior piece, what we're going to do is we're going to get sewing, and I like to start with my straps. And what I'm doing is I'm applying some double-sided tape. My favorite double-sided tape is from Tandy Leather, and it's a leather bond tape that does not gum up my needles, and it comes in various sizes. So here I believe I'm using the thinnest size because my strap, I'm going to make it 3/4 of an inch. So I cut my strap at about 1 1¼ inch wide by the length that I like. And I usually add about 4 or 5 inches to the length of whatever the pattern piece calls for, because I like a little bit longer of a strap. It fits more comfortably over the shoulder. So I'm adding double-sided tape to both sides. And the strips that you see, I will just call it a leather stabilizer. Basically, it is the back of some leather straps that my local leather guy, he thins out straps and donates the shavings to me. So I cut those down and I use them on the inside of my straps, especially with this particular leather because it is a pebble grain leather and it's a little bit stretchy. I want to minimize that stretch. And so what I'll do is I will take off one side of the double-sided tape, and that is towards the edge that I'm going to keep raw. Because this leather is thick, I do not double over and quadruple the size of it. I just half the size, and I fold it over, and one side is going to be raw. So I'm going to paint the raw side. But now what I'm doing is I'm adding this leather stabilizer to just on the inside of the raw edge. I do not want to butt this up against the raw edge because it's going to show, and I do not want this to show. Now I am going to paint the raw edge, and I will not paint in this particular tutorial because I'm just going over the bag tutorial in this video, but I will have a separate leather edge painting tutorial, so you can refer to that on my channel. Now that I've completed adding the leather stabilizer to the strap, I'm folding over to meet the raw edges, to meet as close as possible. And this is going to minimize how much I'm going to have to trim off because I did cut pretty much to the size that I wanted. I didn't leave any room for error. So as you can see, as I'm closing up the sides, you do not see any of the brown from the stabilizer, and that's what I want. I want the raw edges to butt up, and I don't want to see any of that stabilizer. So I'm paying close attention and being careful to butt those raw edges up to where they need to be. Using the seam roller is really handy when it comes to flattening out leather, and using it for these straps is no exception. So I am just flattening out to make my leather as thin as possible, and I'll also use a Teflon coated hammer to assist me as well. An edge guide foot will help you with your seam allowance, keeping those stitches nice and straight and where they're supposed to be. I believe this is a 1/8 inch, but they come in different widths. Now it's time to add some hardware to the straps. This hardware that I'm using is 3/4 inch gold strap ends. And what they do is they just screw in on the back. Right now I'm testing for fit. As I mentioned before, I use 3/4 inch straps, and I just want to make sure that with the bulk of the leather that they're going to fit perfectly. I like to add some E6000 glue, just a small amount to the inside of the strap ends. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to all 4 of my strap ends. And what that does is just help secure the strap ends. It just adds a little bit of a sense of security. You don't have to do that because the screws do hold them in okay, but I just like to add that to the very end. Now I'm taking a awl and just getting started on a little hole so that my screw has something to set in. Then I'm using one of these precision screwdrivers. It is battery operated, but because the leather is so thick, sometimes it just does not work, so I just manually twist it. But the screwdriver bit is perfect for that small hardware. Now it's time to sew the exterior of our bag, and I'm going to start by sewing the middle panel to the side panels, and I am going to go ahead and mark out my seam allowance. And again, I'm using the leather marking pen and a ruler, and I like to do this just because it keeps the seam allowances on point. And then also when you're sewing the base, there is a point where you just want everything to match up exactly. And you don't want to have any of the bag be lopsided or anything like that. So I just really like to mark out my seam allowances. Now, if you have a compensating foot, you can add that to, you can switch out your feet on your machine if you'd like to do that. And that way you don't have to mark out every single seam allowance, but this is what I'm doing. So now I'm just clipping. I use these extra long clips for thicker leather, and I really like them a lot. And just go ahead and sew all of your panel pieces together. Now I butterfly my seams when I'm using leather in this particular one because we're going to top stitch on either side. And for leather, I add glue just to help the sides lay down. And this is contact cement that I use. It's EcoWeld water-based contact cement, and I get this from Tandy Leather. I really like it because it's very low to no odor, and it dries fairly quickly, and it is pretty liquidy, so you only need a little bit. But I add this to both sides of the seam allowance so that when I seam roll my seams, it will adhere. So you have to wait till this dries. So this is what it looks like when your seams have been glued and butterflied. Now we are going to hand skive a little bit of the thickness off of the top of the seams. And what this does, it just is a really sharp blade, and you hold it at an angle and you just reduce some of the thickness so that when you fold it over at the very end, it won't be as thick. Now I'm going to take some headliner foam. This is the foam that I like to use in most of my projects. You can use any foam of your choice to stabilize your bag. Because this is a pebble grain leather, it is a little bit what I call on the floppy side, and I want just a little bit more structure, but I don't want the leather to become hard. So that's why I choose to use this headliner foam. And I just get this at FM Fabrics here in Springfield. Unfortunately, they do not sell online, but you can give them a call and let them know if you're looking for some headliner headliner foam. They will be able to ship it to you. It does come in really long widths, wide widths. So you can also visit any of your local upholstery shops in the area to get headliner foam, or you can use like Annie's Softening Stable, whatever your choice is. You could even use fleece if you wanted to, but I wanted a little bit more structure. So I'm clipping the foam, and you can see on the top there, I am keeping it out of my seam allowances, and I'm just going to top stitch those butterfly seams. And the reason why I'm doing this is that, number one, I don't have to baste the foam when I use the butterfly stitching to the foam. You can baste it if you want to, but I just chose not to on this particular project. And as a side note, I wanted to mention that I have already made the markings on my center panel per the pattern instructions. So that's what you'll notice. Those white markings on my leather those are for the straps, the strap placement. At this point, we are ready to attach our prepared straps to the center panel per the pattern instructions. And you can see I have my marking there. So I am going to go ahead and just line the bottom of my strap end to my marking on my panel. And I will be riveting these straps in. And I like to have the foam on the back that just adds extra support for the rivets. As I'm marking my strap for rivet placement, there are templates that you can purchase, acrylic templates. You can make your own templates out of cardstock. But what I do is I just take, I mark my bottom hole a little bit up from where the strap end is, because when I set my rivet, I don't want the hardware to be scratched by my rivet press. I want to make sure that there's plenty of room for my press to be able to get in, but also to be able to support the strap. So I'll just take a cap of the rivet and I will mark the distance of where I want the holes to be. So then I'll go over to my rivet press and press the holes, and then I'll set my rivets. So after I have punched my holes, I will line up the holes on the strap to where I want the holes on the panel to be, and I will mark that. And I also want to measure to make sure that I have enough for when I fold over the exterior that the strap will not be in the way. So I just measure that, make sure, and then I will go over and punch my holes in the center panel. So the hole's already punched in the strap. I want to punch the hole in the center panel, and then I will set the rivets, connect the strap to the center panel with the rivets. Before I set my rivets, I take a damp cloth and remove the markings from the pen because I do not want that to show on my final product. So this is what the panel will look like, and of course you will go ahead and repeat on the other side. We're going to go ahead and work on applying the feet to the base of the bag. And since this is such a large tote, I'm going to go ahead and add 5 feet. And I went ahead and made my markings. I did my markings about 1¼ to 1½ inch from each side so that they are even on all 4 sides and then centered. So I'm using these big bag feet from Fireweed Stitches, and I did not have the color that I wanted in gold. It just, the color that I had for gold just did not look right with the other gold hardware. So I chose to use gunmetal, which kind of blends in with the black. So that was my best choice. Normally I don't like to mix metals on my bags, but this one looked okay. So I went ahead and did it. This one has a washer and a screw. So it's like the Chicago screw style. And these screws fit so well. Again, I'm taking my precision screwdriver and just screwing that in, holding on to the hexagon shape foot. And I like these feet because they're big, you can hold on to them, and when you screw them in they feel so nice and secure. Now you can go ahead and add a piece of tape to the back, but with the washer I just don't feel that it's necessary. So now we are going to go ahead and start assembling our exterior, and we're going to sew the side seams first. And again, I'm going to go ahead and mark out the seam allowances. And right now, I'm just clipping the side seams together. When I'm done sewing the side seams, I make sure that I mark my seam allowance and leave that amount so that I can fold the top and the bottom seams. I actually butterfly those so that they lay flat. I don't want any bulkiness in my seams, but I also want them to lay flat when I fold them over and also connect the base to my exterior. And now I'm just trimming everything up just to make sure it's nice and even. It's time to add the base. And you want to mark the centers of the middle and of the base and also the exterior panels so that when you're lining it up, it matches perfectly. When you are connecting the base to your exterior panel, it helps if you start on the seam allowance and stop on the seam allowance. So you make sure to have your base marked with that seam allowance because it will help your corners lay flat and even when we get to that point of connecting the sides. You'll see me clipping the corners here, and I'm just clipping the corners of the exterior, not the base. And that is going to help my leather lay flat so that when I squish down the leather and sew this side together, it is going to connect all four sides and it is going to make the leather lay nice and flat so that when you turn out your exterior, the sides are going to be nice and even. You're not going to have any puckers. You're not going to have any lopsidedness because when you clip the corners, you clip just to the seam allowance, but not through the seam allowance. So once you finish sewing your base to your exterior panels and connecting the exterior together, it's basically complete. You want to flip your exterior so that it is facing right side out. And you are going to go ahead and poke those corners out. Make sure that the base is laying nice and flat. There's no puckering and that everything looks the way that you want it to look. And I like to shape my bottom base by just rolling the seams, making sure that they're just laying really beautiful, that everything is nice and even. And that is the exterior complete. At a later time, we will go ahead and roll over the seam allowance. Now we are ready to sew the interior, and I do deviate just a little bit from the pattern just because I have my own preference on how I like to sew my interiors. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start off with the interior overlay, and these are overlays that I have created, and therefore just a nice touch for adding a zipper pocket to the interior. And I do have these SVGs available for purchase on my website, and I will leave a link to my website where you can find all the information that you need as far as supplies and everything, as well as a shopping link for these SVGs. There's several different SVGs available. If you don't have a cutting machine, then I've also listed PDF files so that you can print out PDFs on cardstock and just manually cut out the overlays as well. So I'm applying some double-sided tape to the wrong side of the leather, and I've used the same leather that I used as on the exterior as the overlay for this as well. And I've already measured the center of my interior panel and mark down however many inches that I want from. Usually it's about 2.5 inches from the top, and that way the zipper is not going to get in the way, and I'm still going to have plenty of room for my seam allowance. So I went ahead and centered everything, centered the overlay over my interior panel, and I went ahead and applied that double-sided tape, and that's just going to help keep that in place. As I get ready to sew my overlay, as with a lot of times on my leather, especially sewing anything on the exterior or top stitching, I don't like to backstitch. It's just a personal preference. So I leave my tails really long so that I can pull them to the back and tie a knot. And what I'm doing right now is I'm sewing on the outside of the overlay. So there's an inside portion that's going to connect the zipper, and there's an outside portion. So what I do is I sew the outside first, and I just start in the middle. It's just a personal preference, and I'm have a longer stitch length, and I just go very slowly because this rectangle has rounded corners. I just stop and go as I need, and that way my stitching is always even and it's really straight. And again, I'm using my edge guide so that it keeps my seam allowance and my stitch line nice and straight. So just going over the whole perimeter of that leather zipper overlay. So I'll go ahead and tie the knots from the beginning and the end of my stitching, and I will go ahead and singe them with a lighter, and that way I make sure that they don't unravel. Now what we want to do is we want to cut the hole in our waterproof canvas, and that is going to expose the hole in our zipper overlay, and then we'll be able to install our zipper and our zipper pocket lining. So I'm just very carefully cutting through the waterproof canvas, making sure that I do not cut any part of the zipper overlay leather itself. Now that we have our opening for our zipper overlay, it's time to install our zipper. And I like to cut my zipper 2 inches or more, probably like 3 inches longer than the opening of my zipper overlay. When I'm making a zipper for a zipper overlay, I like to take one of my zipper pulls and install it and completely zip up my zipper. And then what I'll do is I will take the zipper pull and install it so that both sides of the zipper are closed. For me, it just makes it easier when I'm installing the zipper overlay. If I don't have any gaps, I think it leaves just a more professional finish. So when I install my zippers, I like to install them so the zipper pull opens from left to right. You can install it however you'd like. That's just the way I like to do it. So I'm going to install some double-sided tape to the back, and this is where we're going to install the zipper. The zipper teeth will be pointing to the outside of the interior panel through the opening of the overlay. Here you can see I'm installing the zipper, and I want to make sure that number one, my zipper is facing the correct way that I want it to open on the outside, and then number two, that it's secure. So I'm just pressing it into the double-sided tape now, and also I want to make sure that each edge is hanging off so that it is overhang from the opening, because I don't want, for whatever reason, one of the ends to come out of the opening. When you flip it over, you want to double check that the zipper opens and closes nice and smooth, and then you also want to make sure that you have an even amount of space between the zipper coil and the zipper tape, and that is going to give you a more professional finish as well. Now it's time to prepare our pocket lining. And I'm using this batik fabric that we've already interfaced. And I don't like to have any raw edges, especially when I'm using a cotton fabric because it will fray. So I'm going to go ahead and apply my double-sided tape to the back of my zipper pocket lining. We're going to apply our zipper pocket lining so that the wrong side is facing the wrong side of the zipper. And I'm using double-sided tape to make sure that it's secure. We're going to sew this portion down, but while I'm sewing, I don't want it to move. This part is a little bit tricky. What we want to do is we want to line up the wrong side of the lining pocket to the wrong side of the zipper. And there's little lines on most zipper tape, and I just line mine up right underneath the line that's closest to the coil. And what that's going to do is that's going to make sure that I catch on the front side when we begin to sew, and then also make sure that the zipper pull has plenty of clearance. So now we are going to get ready to sew. And what I do is I will start from the side and sew across the bottom up to the other side. And that way, when we connect the top portion in the next step, our sides are already sewn and they're nice and secure. Now we have the bottom portion of our lining pocket connected, and again, I'm just going to go ahead and tie the knots, leaving my tails long so that there's no back stitching. So I'm going to tie the knots from the beginning and from the end, and then singe them with a lighter. Next, it's time to fold up to create our actual pocket. And again, I'm going to add some double-sided tape to the back side so that my edges are not raw. And I'm also going to add some double-sided tape to the top of the zipper. And so that when we connect the top portion of our pocket, it will be nice and secure. Again, we're going to stitch that portion, but while we're stitching, we don't want it to move around. Now it's time to complete the sewing of the overlay portion, and we are going to put our needle down at the side on the top of our last stitch again, so we're not back stitching, but we want to start exactly at that last stitch on the top side, and we're just going to sew a nice straight even line all the way across the top so that it matches and we end up at the same exact stitch at the very end. It's time to close the sides of our pocket so that when we put our items in, nothing will fall out. So what I do is I just get to as close to the edge of the overlay and I just stitch. I will do a reinforcement stitch, so there's really 2 rows of stitching, and then just trim off the excess pocket. Now it's time to sew the slip pocket, and what you want to do is, like the zipper pocket, we want to mark our centers so that when our slip pocket is lined up. It is perfectly lined up from one end to the other. So we're going to take our fabric and we are going to sew around 3 sides and leave an opening so that we can turn it, and then that opening will be sewn up with the top stitching. So after we have used our chopstick to poke out all our corners and we like how the pocket is looking nice and even, we want to go ahead and turn in that opening so that when we top stitch, all of the raw edges are folded in. I add clips to the opening, and then what we're going to do is go ahead and fold the pocket in half. We're going to find the center to lay that on the interior panel, and also we are going to divide this pocket so that it makes 2 pockets for the interior. Sewing the leather trim is really quite simple. All I'm doing is adding some double-sided tape to the wrong side of the leather, and then I'm going to go ahead and add my leather strip and just fold it over the top portion of our slip pocket. The leather strip is longer than the pocket, so once I have decided where I like my leather strip to land, I'm just going to go ahead and cut off the excess. With leather, you can leave the edges raw. Now it's time to find the center of our pocket and line it up with the center of our interior panel. And again, I'm making sure that I'm about 2.5 to 3 inches from the top. You don't want it to be too far down so that it is in line with the bottom, but you don't want it to be too far up either, because when you install your zipper panel for your recessed zipper, it will interfere with you being able to put things in the pocket. In order to make sure that your pocket is lined up, you want to go ahead and measure the distance from one side to the other on both sides, and just make sure that there's the same amount of distance on either side. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and sew up 3 sides. We're going to start from the top, go down to the bottom, and then go all the way up to the top again. And you can backstitch on this if you want. Again, I leave my tails a little bit longer. You can also add some double-sided tape to keep it secure, but I am just going to hold on to my interior panel and my pocket and just start stitching. I couldn't find my hump jumper here, so I just used a pack of needles and it seemed to work fine. But I wanted to make sure that I'm not going to have any skip stitches because I'm starting on this thicker piece when I'm starting to top stitch. So this is the part where we're also closing up the opening for our slip pocket, and so you want to make sure that you go nice and slow, your stitches are nice and precise. I still have my edge guide foot on here, so I'm just letting that seam allowance guide right up against the edge of that pocket so that it keeps a nice seam allowance, closes up the opening, and everything is nice and straight and even. Now it's time to divide our pocket, and we are just finding the center crease that we made earlier and just go ahead and stitch right along that. Back stitch if you want to, or leave your tails long and tie a knot at the back. It's all up to you. And then what I am going to do at the very end is I am going to rivet. I'm going to rivet on each side, and then I'm going to rivet on each side of the middle divider. I like those for decoration, and it also gives me a sense of security. Next, we are going to prepare our zipper panel. And what I like to do is I like to bend the opening of my zipper at a 90-degree angle so that when it opens, it just looks really nice when it's attached to that zipper panel. So I'm applying some double-sided tape, and that's going to help me secure those folds. Now we want to go ahead and apply some double-sided tape to our zipper panel. This is going to help us secure our zipper, make sure that the teeth are even and the coil looks really nice on the zipper panel. And I'm using leather on our zipper panel, and it doesn't need any interfacing or anything like that. This leather is pretty thick. I didn't skive this part down or anything like that, so it will hold its shape really nice, and I didn't want to add any more bulk to it. So now I'm just adding the leather panel to the zipper tape. I'm going to make sure that on both sides my teeth are nice and evenly spaced out so that when it's applied to the bag and the closure, it looks really good. Now it's time to top stitch both sides. Now it's time to add our zipper panel, and I'm adding some double-sided tape to make sure that the zipper panel will stay secure until I'm ready to stitch. And you want to make sure that your sides are nice and even. So here I am just measuring one side of the zipper panel, comparing it to the next to make sure that there's an even amount of space on both sides. We are getting ready to install the top panel, which is going to be matched up to our exterior when we get ready for final assembly. And you can baste stitch this zipper panel if you would like to, but what I do is I just use double-sided tape, and then I'll go ahead and add the panel onto that and just stitch it all at once. So our panel is complete, and now we need to sew on the leather tab that's going to act as a zipper stop. And what I do is I just take a piece of leather, fold that over and stitch it, and that panel will be complete. Our zipper panel is now complete, and now it's to sew up the side seams. So I am going to go ahead and once again mark my seam allowances, sew up the side seams on both sides, and then we will attach the base in the same manner as the exterior. Now in the pattern, You will leave an opening if you're turning, but again, I'm doing a drop-in lining, so I'm going to go ahead and close up all the sides and all the sides on the base as well, because at a later time, which I will show you when we get ready to prepare for the drop-in lining, we're going to fold over those edges. We're going to glue and then fold over the edges and then just literally drop in our lining into our exterior, and I'm going to hand stitch this closed. We are now at the point where it's time to prepare for drop-in lining. What we need to do is we need to go ahead and apply glue to both sides of the interior and the exterior. And we're going to fold down our edges so that there are no raw edges. You can leave the edges raw if you'd like, but I prefer the look of folded down edges. So here I am just using my rubber mallet after the glue has dried, and I've folded over my seam allowance and also using my seam roller to get those seams nice and flat. And I'm going to go ahead and repeat this process for the exterior as well. So after the seams are glued, just drop the interior into the exterior. And you'll see me doing some saddle stitching here, and I just did that all the way across the top after I punched my holes, and that's how I'm closing up this bag today. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.